Okay, folks, welcome back. So, you want some good news? Good news is this is the last mini lecture of Chapter 1, and not only that, but this is really lab stuff. So, let me talk about that for a second, because you're going to ask me this question, and I'll tell you face to face as well. But where do I make the delineation between lecture and lab? And here's the answer. They're connected. Form dictates function, as we talked about already. So, what do I do in testing? Well, on the anatomy chapters, like this right here is a portion of chapter 1 that is strictly anatomy. Chapter 5 is skin, 6 is bone. Chapters 7 and 8 are anatomy chapters. One's the axial skeleton and one's the appendicular skeleton. Chapter 11 is an anatomy chapter. It's the muscular system anatomy. So what about those chapters? Well, I don't test you explicitly on those chapters on lecture exams, but I do use the terminology. So what does that mean? I don't test you explicitly. It means I don't give you a picture on the lecture exam and say, name that bone, name that muscle. I don't do that. I do that in lab. Your lab practicals are that, where I point to something and say, name it. So I won't give you a picture on the lecture exam and say name that muscle or name that bone from chapter 7 or 8 or say 11. But I do feel free to use the nomenclature in those chapters. So, read them and realize that I'm going to use the scientific terminology that you're going to read in those chapters. All right, so let's get back to this, 1-7 and 1-8. I'm not going to go through every single word on here. You basically have to memorize this for lab. On your lab handout sheet, it'll say, memorize this image. Let me tell you, I think this is extremely important, and I'll give you some examples. Whoa. So here's some examples of why this is so important. If you remember that this is the acromial area, there's a process on the scapula that you're going to have to learn later called the acromion process. There's a process there's a process on the ulna that you're going to have to learn later called the olecranon process. You can see the olecranal or olecranal area, olecranon process. There's some nerves that run through this popliteal fossa called the popliteal nerves, and etc. Sural is the back of the lower leg. There's a muscle in here called the triceps surae. It's the two heads of the gastrocnemius and the soleus. This is called the triceps surae. And see, it's easier to remember things like that if you remember this is the sural area. We'll talk about the plantaris muscle that runs down through and goes to the plantar surface of your foot. We will talk about hallucis muscles. You see the word for big toe is hallux. The word for thumb is pollex. We'll talk about pollicus extensor and pollicus flexor and hallucis extensor and hallucis flexor. So we'll talk about muscles that go to the big toe and the thumb. So the point I'm getting at is this. This seems like you're just memorizing words and parts of the body. Yeah, you are. You have to start someplace. You really do. You have to start someplace and say, okay, I am just going to put 4 hours into this and commit this to memory. Now, that becomes base knowledge that you can build on, and you can relate things to it. And that's what learning is. Learning is taking something you don't know and relating it to something you do know. But you have to know something first, and sometimes that's rote memory. That's just sitting down and doing the hard work of rote memorization, and I'm asking you to do that with this picture. Sit down and memorize it. Okay, so make sure you know all of these areas of the body, every word that's on here. Now, in allied health and medicine and healthcare, we divide the abdominal pelvic cavity up into 4 quadrants, or, here's the 4 quadrants, or 9 regions. Here's the 9 regions. All right. In my time in healthcare, because I used to be a medical technologist, so I still am a medical technologist, I'm just not working in the field, we always talked about the quadrants. And this is how it exists on you if you were to draw this cross on your abdominal pelvic cavity. So this is the right upper quadrant. The right upper quadrant has the liver in it. This is the left upper quadrant. It has the spleen in it. This is the right lower quadrant right here. It has a bunch of intestines in it and the appendix. This is the left lower quadrant right here. Sigmoid and more intestines. So you can see that these quadrants are how they exist on the person. So yes, as you're looking at this, this is your left, but as it exists on this person, it's the right upper quadrant. Notice that the cross he's drawn on himself, he or she draws on themselves, goes right down through the umbilical, the belly button, right down through here. So you take a line, you go right down through the belly button. You take a horizontal line, you go right through the belly button, and then you have your quadrants. Okay. Conversely, if you're going to do regions, the 9 regions, you draw a tic-tac-toe image. And your 2 vertical lines are called mid-clavicular lines. By the way, you don't have to know that. It's approximately from the nipple down. Approximately. But really it's mid-clavicular because it's the mid-clavicle, mid-collarbone or clavicle. You can see that, and by the way, I say approximately the nipple down because, different people's nipples are located in different areas of their pectoral region. They could be wider or narrower or whatever. But these 2 mid-clavicular lines, approximately from the nipple down. And then your 2 horizontal lines box in your umbilical, your belly button. They box it in. All right, so now I have my tic-tac-toe sign. And I name these regions like this. Here's my right hypochondriac region. Here's my epigastric. Here's my left hypochondriac. Here's my right lumbar. Here's my left lumbar. What is the center of the tic-tac-toe box called? The umbilical region. Here's my right inguinal. Some people say right iliac, but you can say right iliac or right inguinal. Here's my hypogastric. See, epigastric, hypogastric. And here's my left inguinal or left iliac. And those are the 9 regions. Now this is one superimposed upon the other. That's what this is right here. So you can see that my right inguinal, my hypogastric, and my left inguinal, it pretty much takes up my right lower quadrant and my left lower quadrant. See, the blue line is my quadrants and the red line is my regions. So these inguinals and hypogastric encompass my right lower and left lower quadrants. All right. Now what about my right upper and left upper quadrant? It encompasses my lumbars, my umbilical, my lumbar, and my hypochondriac, epigastric, and hypochondriac. Now, in lab, I'm going to say not only do you have to know the regions and the quadrants, but you're going to need to know representative organs for each region or quadrant. It's easy because look at the liver. Their liver could be the right hypochondriac, or the liver could be the epigastric. The liver is also the right upper quadrant, but doesn't it go into the left upper quadrant a little bit? You bet. See? Right there. Right there. So some of these organs, the transverse colon right through here, crosses more than one area. So sometimes picking an organ, especially an intestinal organ, you can really get it right because it crosses more than one area. Make sure you memorize this for lab. Okay, we're going to do this terminology in lab: proximal, distal, medial, lateral, anterior, posterior, cranial, or cephalic versus caudal. All right, we're going to do these in lab. I'm not going to spend a lot of time right here. And then these sections or planes we're going to do in lab as well, and I'm going to tell you how I'm going to test you on them. I think I have a pretty cool way of testing you on these sections or planes, and we'll do these in lab right here. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time with this right now, and then I'll spend some time in lab as well. I have 2 main cavities in my body. I have a dorsal cavity and a ventral cavity. The dorsal cavity is my cranial cavity and my vertebral cavity. So that's my dorsal. So my dorsal is cranial and vertebral. Well, how come it's not on here? I'll tell you in a second. My ventral cavity can be subdivided into thoracic and abdominal pelvic. All right. The thoracic cavity can be subdivided further into the pericardial cavity containing the heart and the pleural cavity containing the lungs. Hard delineation between the thoracic and abdominal pelvic, it's called the diaphragm. It's a muscle, your breathing muscle. And then my abdominal pelvic cavity can be subdivided further into the abdominal cavity, the light blue, and the pelvic cavity, the darker blue. There is no hard delineation between those two. There isn't something right there. There's not a muscle right there that says you are leaving the abdominal cavity and you are entering the pelvic cavity. There isn't that there. What I will show you is the iliac crest and the iliac spines of the innominate bone. I'll show you that and show you an approximate way of saying, okay, there's my end of my abdominal cavity, beginning of my pelvic cavity. All right, but it's an imaginary line though. And then this cavity, the abdominal pelvic cavity, can be divided further into the peritoneal cavity. All right, so what I really want to talk about now is the pleural cavity, the pericardial cavity, and the peritoneal cavity. Those three cavities are called serous cavities. They are surrounded by a serous membrane. And actually, they're surrounded by a double membrane, two serous membranes. And the heart, the lungs, and all the viscera of my abdominal pelvic cavity, viscera being the term I'm going to use for the organs of the abdominal pelvic cavity, viscera, those organs are like a fist being pushed into a balloon, what you see right here. All right. So this could be the heart, or this could be the lungs, or this could be the stomach. It could be an organ like that. Now what happens is you have part of your serous membrane that touches the heart or the lungs or the stomach. And this is called the visceral membrane. All right. And then you have the part of the membrane of this double membrane system that doesn't directly touch the fist, the heart, the lungs, or the stomach. And that's called the parietal membrane. So the visceral membrane is touching my organ and the parietal membrane is not. All right? So I got two membranes, two serous membranes. What it means to be a serous membrane is you secrete a thin watery fluid called a serous fluid, and you secrete it into here. That's your serous fluid. So this balloon has a potential space. That means there's not really air or a space there. It's potential space, but there's a fluid filling that space. So the fluid between the parietal and visceral membranes is a serous fluid, a thin watery fluid. Now where that thin watery fluid exists is called the serous cavity. In the case of the serous membrane surrounding the lungs, it's called the pleural cavity. In the case of the serous membrane surrounding the heart, it's called the pericardial cavity. In the case of the serous membrane surrounding the abdominal pelvic viscera, it's called the peritoneal cavity. Now, because I have those three serous cavities, I can say I have a visceral pleura and a parietal pleura. See, I have a visceral pleura and a parietal pleura because I have a pleural cavity. I must have a visceral membrane touching the lung and a parietal membrane not touching the lung that lines the inside of my rib cage. I must have a visceral pleura and a parietal pleura. I also, with the pericardial cavity, must have a visceral pericardium and a parietal pericardium. My visceral pericardium touches my heart. My parietal pericardium does not touch my heart. I also must have a visceral and parietal peritoneum for my peritoneal cavity. I have a membrane that touches my stomach and intestines, and I have a membrane that doesn't touch my stomach and intestines. So I have a visceral peritoneum and a parietal peritoneum. Now, that's not even the hard part. Or maybe it is. Depends on how you learn. What the hard part is this. As you're reading your text, they're going to tell you that this space in the balloon is the serous cavity. This airspace, and by the way, there's no air in it, but in the balloon there is. In the balloon there's air, if you blow it up. This airspace is your cavity. Now, the fist is not really in the balloon. It's not really in the cavity. But the cavity certainly surrounds the fist. Likewise, My lungs aren't really in the pleural cavity, but the pleural cavity surrounds my lungs. My heart isn't really in the pericardial cavity, but my pericardial cavity surrounds my heart. Much of my viscera in my abdominal pelvic cavity, intestines, the stomach, and spleen, etc., much of my viscera isn't really in my peritoneal cavity, but the peritoneal cavity surrounds my viscera. Because these cavities surround those organs, we kind of say, and we don't kind of say it, we say the heart's in the pericardial cavity. We say the lungs are in the pleural cavity. We say the stomach is in the peritoneal cavity. Now, we all understand, and now you do, that is it technically in that space where there's serous fluid? No. But that space where there's serous fluid, and it's actually not even a space really, it contains serous fluid, surrounds that organ. So we loosely say that that organ's inside the cavity. All right. That's your serous cavities in a nutshell. This is something you can do to look at these cavities. So my cranial cavity and my spinal cavity, this one and this one make up my dorsal cavity. So I can go like this, and it gives me that. I hope you guys can hear that. It goes ding. And then what's this one? Cranial. Yeah, it is. Oh, I just put it in the wrong spot. What's this one? Vertebral, pelvic, vertebral canal. Better be this one. This better be spinal cord. And then you can keep going. What if you do it wrong? It wouldn't even let you do it wrong. Alright, so there you go. So this one's abdominal. And what is the thoracic and the abdominal pelvic together? In other words, this one, ventral body cavity. What's this one, which is the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity together? The abdominal pelvic cavity. Whereas this one's pelvic cavity. This one's thoracic. This the breathing muscle of the diaphragm. There you go. So you can't do this in this video, of course. What you can do is you go grab the PowerPoint presentation that's on Blackboard for you, and you can do that in there. And likewise, you can do it with this one. You can drag these over. A little exercise for you. You can look at some of the organs of the abdominal pelvic cavity. You can see the liver and the stomach and the intestines there. You can see that. And then, let me just play this for you. That's like the fist going in the balloon. And before I keep going, look at, I have part right here. This is the visceral pleura. And this is my parietal pleura. This is a potential space. It's not a real space. It has serous fluid in it. It's called intrapleural fluid. Matter of fact, if blood gets in there, you have a hemothorax. And if air gets in there, you have a pneumothorax, and your lung collapses. So it's not normal to have anything in there except for that thin, watery serous fluid. So you can see the visceral and the parietal membranes. All right? Hopefully that makes sense to you. And that's it for Chapter 1, folks. See you in Chapter 2.